started using the appliance. And so as I exit the installer, it actually pops up with a Firefox window with the address already pre-populated. And we see that we get a your connection is not secure because it's a self-signed certificate. So I'm just going to go ahead and click the advanced button and add the exception and confirm the exception. And we see that we get our VMware getting started page here. So as you can see, there's a few links here. There's a link to the web client, the Flash-based one, the HTML5 client that has partial functionality, some vSphere documentation, and also a link to what functionality is supported in the HTML5 client. But if you basically always hit this link if you're not sure how to get to the vSphere web client or whatever, you're basically just going to hit the IP address of the appliance itself, and that's it. And it'll take you to this page, and then it has links to all of that stuff. And of course, if you were using DNS, you would just use the DNS name here, and it would take you to the same page. And so just to show you what I'm talking about real quick, let me pull up a new tab here, and I'll just type in the IP address of the vCenter server appliance and hit enter, and you see it takes me right to the getting started page. So you can just always use this as your reference if you need to. Alright, so let's get started with checking out some of these clients. So we'll start with the web client or the Flash-based one first. Now this is going to be the full-featured client that supports or has support for all of the vCenter vSphere offerings and products and add-ins and all that stuff. But you'll see that we pull it up here by accessing the vSphere-client, and it asks us to log in using the administrator account and specifying our SSO domain, which is going to be vSphere.local, and using the password that we created during the install process. And I'm just going to give this a second to load here. Alright, so here you can get the general idea of what the Flash client is going to look like. And you'll see that the instance right now is basically empty. There's nothing in the inventory, but we see all of our basic options here for managing the instance, as well as with version 6.5, we also have the addition of the update manager rolled up into the web client now as well. And you also do not need a separate VM server for that either. So let's go ahead and pull up the HTML5 client and let that load as well. And I'm just going to give that a second here. And once we have both consoles up, we'll go ahead and explore them both. Alright, so in here you can get the idea of what the HTML5 client looks like, and it looks a lot like the Flash client, but you'll see that there's some things missing, some things are a little bit different, and overall it has a little bit different look and feel to it. And generally, I actually prefer the HTML5 client. I think most people do. It's a little leaner, cleaner, and more responsive. And oh, you know what? There is one more console or portal that I want to mention here, and let's go ahead and log in. I'm going to log into the ESXi hypervisor that is running the vCenter server appliance, and let's take a look and see what it looks like for the appliance at the normal VM console, so you can get an idea of what that looks like. Alright, so again, I'm on the ESXi hypervisor that is running the vCenter server appliance. So we're actually going to look at it, like, so we're going to see it from a VM perspective. So we see the server appliance here, and I'm just going to right click and open my VMware console so I can see what would be on the screen if I was actually like physically sitting in front of this. And I'm just going to launch the remote console. Alright, and so what do you know, it looks exactly like an ESXi hypervisor looks like whenever it's fully booted up, except instead of the gray and yellow, it's gray and blue, and then it also has some information about the appliance itself, along with some information and URLs and stuff on how to manage it. And then we see at the bottom we have the same F2 to customize, F12 to enter the shutdown startup options. But that's it, so I'm just going to go ahead and close out of there. So like I said, we have our maintenance portal, which is accessed by the IP address of the server appliance and specifying that port of 5480, and then we also have the vSphere web client, which is accessed by the IP address of the server appliance / vSphere-client, and this is used for general everything with vCenter that you're going to do. And then we also have the HTML5 client, which is similar to the vSphere web client, but it can also be used for your normal day-to-day, but that's going to be accessed by the IP address of the vSphere appliance / UI. And if all else fails and you get lost, you can always just go to the IP address of the vCenter server appliance itself, and that'll take you to the getting started page. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the vSphere web client, and let's get started building out our data center. We'll get some hosts added into here and get some VM set up, and I'll show you what this is all about. So I'm just going to right click and create a new data center, and for my data center name, I'm just going to name it lab. And then I'm going to click OK, and you'll see that it'll show our data center up here on the left-hand menu, but you'll notice that there's no host in our data center. So let's go ahead and right click on the data center itself, and I'm going to add a host. And this is going to be an ESXi host. So I'm going to use the IP address of, this is actually going to be the ESXi host I created in the previous video. I'm just going to add that IP address in there and click next, and then I'm going to type in my username and password. And those are just the normal username and password for that ESXi host. And I'm going to click yes to accept the certificate and connect to the host. And we see that it automatically picks up the virtual machines that are already on the host. And this is actually the same host hosting the server appliance. And I'm just going to click next, and I'm just going to leave it on the evaluation license and hit next. And for lockdown mode, I'm just going to leave that as the default of disabled. And for the VM location, I'm just going to go with the default of lab. You'll see that was already selected here. I'm just going to go ahead and click next. And then it says ready to complete, and we see it picked up everything correctly. So I'm just going to go ahead and click finish. And you'll notice that it actually shows up as disconnected right here. But then down at the task, the recent task, you'll see that it's still working on it. And there it goes, it just completed. But so now I'm actually going to go ahead and add an additional host into the vCenter here. And I'm just going to follow the exact same steps. It's just going to be like the previous one, except this one's going to be .52 instead of 51. But it's another ESXi 6.5 host that I've already set up. And like I said, I'm just going to follow the same steps, but I'm just going to go ahead and skip through these really quickly here. Alright, so at this point we have a basic vCenter server appliance set up. We have a few hosts added into our data center. So let's go ahead and take a look around and see what we've got going on here. So you notice the menu on the left-hand side, we can expand out a host and then select virtual machines that are located on that host. So say the .51 host here, we'll notice that's got 3 virtual machines on it. So if I click on the Ubuntu one, we notice that it looks very similar to how it looked managing it on the ESXi host directly. So we've got all the same basic settings, but we've also got some additional functionality added here. But you'll notice like we got the same menu layout here, we still have our actions button, but here's where things start to get interesting. So while we still have all the regular options, power, guest OS, snapshots, console, and all that, you'll notice some additional menu items here, like migrate, clone, template, fault tolerance, update manager down at the bottom. And this is all additional functionality that comes with vCenter, and you wouldn't see these items normally exposed in the ESXi manager that you would when managing a host directly. And another thing you'll notice here is that we've also got multiple ESXi hosts that we can manage through this one console here, where normally you would have to log into each host directly and manage it through its own individual console. So now we can centrally manage all of our ESXi hosts. So what does this all mean exactly? Well, now that the hypervisors are connected together by a central resource, we can now do some advanced stuff between them, like move virtual machines. So take this .51 hypervisor here and the Ubuntu 1 virtual machine. Now it's actually currently powered off, but what I'm going to do is just right click and click on migrate, and then I can actually move this machine from one hypervisor to another. And I'm just going to click on change both compute resource and storage, and go ahead and click next. And then for my compute resource, I'm going to select the other hypervisor that's on the environment, the .52, and I'm going to go ahead and click next. And then it's going to ask me to select the storage that I want to move the virtual machine to on the destination hypervisor. And I'm just going to go ahead and select the 40 gig local and click next. And then lastly, it'll ask me to select the network that I want to use on the destination hypervisor. And this is going to be the network that I want to connect the virtual machine to. And I'm just going to go with the default selection there and go ahead and click next and then click finish to begin the migration process. And that's just going to take a second to finish up there. But there are some ways where you can even do this where the virtual machine is turned on with no downtime. But of course, there are some restrictions around that. But you can see that it actually already completed the migration. And we can see that our Ubuntu One machine is now moved to a completely different hypervisor. So we just moved a virtual machine from one physical host to a completely different physical host on completely different storage. But it's going to run exactly the same as it did. The hardware is allocated to it is all exactly the same. It still has the same amount of vCPUs, memory, all of that stuff. It'll still use the same IP address that it was using if a static IP address was set. And it should have access to the same network because both of these hypervisors are on the same network. But that's it. We just completely moved a virtual machine. And now say if this was a bigger hypervisor and we need to give this virtual machine more resources, now we can. We don't have to rebuild it on a completely different host or anything like that. It's crazy. We just completely move this thing just like that in a matter of moments. All right, so now let's try something a little bit different. One of the other things that makes VMware vCenter so useful is the ability to clone virtual machines. So let's go ahead and power off the Ubuntu One virtual machine real quick. And then let's go ahead and take the Ubuntu 2 machine up here. And I'm just going to right click. I'm going to go to clone. And then clone to virtual machine. And now it's going to make a complete duplicate of this virtual machine. And it asks me to enter a name for the new virtual machine. And I'm just going to do Ubuntu-3. And I'm just going to select my lab and click next. And then for the compute source, I'm going to do the .52. And then I'm going to click next. And for storage, I'm just going to select that 40 gig local and click next. And then that's it. I'm just going to go ahead and click next and finish. And then that's it. It goes and begins the cloning process. And that's all there is to it. We just completely cloned an entire virtual machine. And now it's on, and it's also on an entirely different hypervisor as well. But now we can go ahead and power it on, and it'll be an exact copy of that virtual machine. It'll have the same vCPUs, the same settings, the same memory, and the exact same hard disk. So anything that was installed on there will be installed on this one as well. So if Ubuntu was installed on it, I actually didn't install it yet. It was just an empty shell for an Ubuntu install. But if it was installed, it would just go ahead and power on and boot Ubuntu. And as long as the static IP address wasn't set, it would also pick up a IP address through DHCP. And you'd also want to make sure that the host name was changed inside the OS. But other than that, we have a completely new and additional virtual machine on the network, and that's it. And you can go ahead and you can power it on, and you can console into it, and you can do everything you would normally do with a virtual machine without having to install from scratch and configure the virtual machine and then boot the operating system and configure it and all that. Alright, one last thing is I want to show the HTML5 client real quick now that we got some stuff populated in vCenter, but you'll see that it basically looks nearly identical to the Flash-based web client. It's a little bit cleaner overall in its design and everything. It's a little bit snappier to respond, but overall it looks very similar. You'll notice some things aren't available, like the update manager isn't available in the HTML5 client, but your right-click menus will work basically the same, your action menus and all that. You can still do your migrations, your clones, and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's where I'm going to wrap this one. This is the third and final video in my VMware series that I've been working on, and I hope you guys found it informal and useful, and you know, found some stuff to take away from it, and hopefully get you into using VMware ESXi and vCenter. And honestly, like the whole reason I did this is because I just been looking at, and it's just they're great products to work with, and I hope it helps you guys get into it, and I hope you get you running your own hypervisors at home. And with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.